Since I was a kid, I wanted to join the army and fight for my country. You know, I went through scouts and then I went into cadets and I loved it. And so as a result, as soon as I finished school, I enlisted pretty much straight away. And
I really joined for the experience of possibly going overseas. I used to do tree work as an arborist or tree surgeon, and basically I enjoyed that work, and it got to a point that I wanted to do something different, and I knew if I didn't join the army soon I probably wouldn't be young enough to do it later.
In the early 1990s, whilst walking through Sydney, Scott saw a poster about the deaths in East Timor at the hands of the Indonesian military.
So I think it was from the East Timorese Alliance Party stating that 100,000 people have been killed since Indonesian occupation in 1975.
For 500 years, East Timor was a Portuguese colony. By 1975, Portugal abandoned the Asian territory, and powerful neighbour Indonesia invaded it on the 7th of December 1975. The United Nations has refused to recognise Indonesian sovereignty over East Timor.
In World War II, Australians were quite heavily involved in fighting against the Japanese with the aid of the Timorese there at the time. I thought Australia always had an obligation to look after and help its neighbours. So I remember when Paul Keating was the Prime Minister of Australia, and he had big bodyguards pushing back these smaller East Timorese women who were protesting about him meeting Indonesian head officials at the time in Australia.
Successive Australian governments turned a blind eye to human rights abuses in order not to offend Indonesia. Pete and Scott, after completing their Army basic training or boot camp, are both allocated to the Infantry Corps, better known as foot soldiers, grunts or gunfighters. Pete and Scott would both end up in 4 Section 2 Platoon Alpha Company, 4RAR. The section would be known as 1-2 Alpha for short. The section is one of the Australian Army's smallest warfighting groups and consists of 8 or 9 soldiers. The section is commanded by a corporal, known as a section commander, or SECO for short. The section commander carries a great responsibility as he must train his soldiers and finds himself at the sharp edge of battle.
After a while we had a couple of different corporals, and then we got one who ended up taking us overseas and training us to go overseas. And he was a bit of a mad hatter. But when it came down to it, he looked after us, you know, and I honestly believe that if it wasn't for his training, and the likelihood is one of us or a few of us could have not come home. It was simply because of the brutality in his training that we had the fighting skills to fight hard, and as he used to say, train hard, fight easy, and we did.
In a standard infantry section, every soldier is assigned a specific job. The 2 soldiers in front of the section during a patrol are called scouts. They are the eyes and ears, or early warning. The scouts are usually the first to be involved in a shootout or contact with the enemy. Pete would be the number 1 scout. 2 soldiers carry machine guns to give the section firepower. One is the main gunner and the other the assault gunner. Scott Sherwin would be an assault gunner.
To me it was like I was trained for war.
And you don't do that. Place nice.
And it felt like I was going to war. So it was a very big type of event in my life.
As Indonesian dictator Suharto is removed from power in 1998, the possibility of independence for East Timor grows. The Indonesian military, TNI, begin organising pro-Indonesian Timorese into militia groups to attack or kill those supporting independence. On 22 February 1999, the Clinton administration informs the Australian government that a peacekeeping mission in East Timor is unavoidable and international action is needed to stop the Asian territory descending into anarchy. The Australian government is afraid to get involved. The United States calls Australia defeatist. In response to Western pressure, the Indonesian government gives the UN approval to oversee a referendum on independence for the small territory on 30 August 1999. The Indonesian government expects the local people to vote overwhelmingly for integration with Indonesia. But the ballot goes the other way, and now the violence is out of control. The Australian government denies the Indonesian government is behind a scorched earth policy for revenge. Australian public pressure builds, and the reluctant government decides to intervene in late September 1999. Major General Peter Cosgrove, a Vietnam War veteran, heads the INTERFET International Force East Timor mission. This is Australia's largest military operation since the Vietnam War. The Australian government maintains the line that Australian troops are in East Timor to separate the two warring Timorese factions, those who favour integration with Indonesia and those who favour independence. In September 1999, a team of Green Berets, the United States Army's elite special forces, was stationed in East Timor's capital, Dili. The team's mission is to gather intelligence. It is warned not to leave the confines of Dili. The order comes from the very top in Washington. To avoid international media exposure, the US Green Berets pose as military engineers, helping to rebuild burned down houses and schools. One of the Green Beret sergeants reveals, "This is a gunfight between you Aussies and Indonesians." By October 1999, Indonesian troops were pulled out of East Timor, but Australian troops are warned that Indonesian Special Forces, Kopassus, have stayed behind. At the start of 2000, the INTERFET mission hands over responsibility for security to the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor, UNTAYET. The international media lose interest in East Timor as they believe the situation has improved, but the militia groups are just biding their time. Private Leonard Manning becomes the first New Zealand soldier killed in East Timor on 24 July 2000 near the border town of Suai. His patrol is ambushed by a large militia group. His body was later found mutilated. The New Zealand patrol found 2 militia camps and Indonesian army equipment, including a uniform with Kopassus patches.
I honestly believed that there was a very good chance that I wasn't coming home.
It was just a waiting game Because it was a UN operation where Australia basically patrolled the border, we were the ones that were most likely, and New Zealanders, to be in any conflict with militia or militia elements. With the New Zealand soldier who did die there, but his body was mutilated afterwards. I think in the back of our minds we knew that if we were caught behind or captured, that we'd basically be killed, or if not, we'd be cut up and then killed. So our choices were quite limited.
4RAR starts its 6-month tour of East Timor in April 2001. This is 4RAR's first combat operation since the Vietnam War, when it completed 2 tours in 1968-69 and 1971-72. Battalion headquarters would be at Balibo. Alpha Company would be based at Batu Gade. In Balibo, 5 Australian-based newsmen were killed in 1975 by Indonesian Kopassus troops.
We went out on our first bush foot patrol, a real patrol, or green hat patrol we used to call them, green and blue hat. Blue hat being, didn't matter if the locals saw us, we were out to win hearts and minds type thing. You know, we'd walk around and say hello to all the locals and talk to them. And green hat patrol being, you're in the bush, you're cammed up and primed and ready for action. I was walking along the track and it actually gave way underneath me on the side of a very steep, it was almost a cliff. And we were carrying 36 litres of water plus ammunition plus, I mean our pack weighed good 50, 60 kilos at least. So it didn't take much for the ground to give way underneath me. I was hanging on by a root of a tree that came out from the ground, and my number 2 scout reached down to help me up, and I went to pass my rifle up to him with the barrel pointed ahead, because obviously I couldn't exactly turn it around because I had one hand holding on for grim life and the other holding my rifle. Our section commander actually yelled at me for it. not yelled out loud, but we got in trouble. I got in trouble. Finally we got up and kept going, and we went down in through the scrub, and on this particular patrol, being our first patrol, we were all quite jumpy and bumped into a lot of locals moving around, moving across the border to and from, carrying fuel and other sorts of goods that they used to trade to survive, I suppose. There was many times on that particular patrol that I was confronted by people and nearly opened fire out of sheer surprise. And the look in a lot of these people's eyes, I could almost see the reflection of the Grim Reaper because they were absolutely terrified. One girl came around and I had my rifle to my shoulder, squeezing the trigger, and she came around and she actually giggled, and when she saw my face she looked at me in horror because I think it was a nervous sort of giggle, and then she got quite scared, and I just pulled my rifle down and moved on. But the reason we were following tracks is because the lantana over there, which is like a vine, in places was so thick that you literally could not move through it even with machetes. You know, it was just pretty thick stuff. So quite a lot of the time, just to be able to move around freely, we had to use the tracks that the locals used. On this particular patrol, We set up in a aggressive harbour. It was known as, or a track squat, because under the UN banner you are not allowed to set ambushes because it's basically letting the rabbit walk right into the trap and then just shooting it. And so we set up in quite a few track squats, which means basically you sit on the track and wait for trouble to come to you. And we were told by the locals this particular track was not used by anyone other than militia. So our section commander basically said to me, shoot first and ask questions later because it's your life on the line. But this particular night we were sitting on the track and this over the radio came that there was 25, I think it was either Recon or the SAS had seen them cross the border and were coming along our track.
2424, this is 2929 over. Golf 24, Golf 24, this is Golf 29, Golf 29 over. This is Golf 29, Golf 29 over.
Now before nightfall, myself and my number 2 scout, we had put out early morning, which means we had trip IR infrared flashing lights that when it's tripped, it flashes a light so that you can only see it in your night vision goggles so that they don't even know they have set off an alarm basically. And what we also did was there was these palm leaves that were laying right next to the track, and a few metres up the track we left one on the track, so in the hope that possibly they'd step on it. Anyway, that same night we were sitting there and we were all at stand 2, which means you're all ready to fight. Basically everyone's awake and everyone's alert. We had our grenades out of our pouches because we were told that we are not moving from that spot regardless of what happened. A little bit later on in the night we heard a crunch and everything went silent. All the lizards, the birds, absolutely everything just went dead silent. And I mean, I could hear my heartbeat in my chest. We stood to for a good another hour or so, and nothing happened. In the morning, we got up, and I was sent out with my number 2 to bring in the early warning devices. And when we got out there, we actually found one of the leaves had a dirty, great big footprint crunched right in the middle of it. They were within metres of us, but we would never know what might have happened had they have kept walking.
In early June 2001, Corporal Kevin Bambi Campbell, Section Commander of 12 Alpha, unexpectedly asks to see the unit chaplain, Padre Yench. Bambi would ask the Padre to pray for the protection of his men when out on patrol. He would also tell close colleagues he had a feeling something bad was going to happen.
Whilst you're doing that, shut up and listen in. Latest int rep. Area consists of mainly large palm trees with patches of lantana. The village is in a large natural amphitheatre with steep rocky sides to the north and the west.
One of us would face our back towards the lantana and put our rifle across our chest, and the other would just push straight through and basically try and crush the lantana as we went. And we did this for a good couple of hours and just absolutely exhausting. And our secco eventually stopped us for lunch, but myself and my number 2 couldn't eat because we knew if we stuck anything in our mouth we'd vomit. Up we got, and I turned to my number 2 and I said, look mate, can you take over at the front because I'm knackered.
Meanwhile, Scott Sherwin is in the back of the patrol and senses something wrong with the vegetation.
Something was telling my head that I should be putting a thumb down sign, which meant that there were enemy, but there was no way that I could say that there was. So thinking I'd be told I was stupid, I didn't do anything.
We could smell,
and
the locals had a scent that we could always smell them before we saw them. My number 2, who was now the lead scout, pushed through a bit of this lantana and he'd stopped. So I stopped. I looked through what was like a tunnel through part of the lantana, and I happened to see a local walking along with a white shirt with a machete, and he was just sort of waving it in the grass, looking quite nonchalant. There was nothing going on. Being that we saw them everywhere, and that pretty much every second person had a machete, it was not uncommon. And I turned my head around to look at our section commander to see what he wanted us to do, whether he wanted us to stay still and not be seen, or just continue moving. And as I did that, I saw his face. He was looking at me quite angrily. He was a bit of an angry man at the best of times. And then I sort of nudged my head to sort of say, look over that direction. And when he did, he looked over, and all of a sudden I saw him bring his rifle up to his shoulder. Basically from there, the noise just was tremendous. There was very little individual bangs type noises. It was all just sort of one big phenomenal noise.
And suddenly I heard a bang as the first shot went, and then an eruption of fire from the front, and I thought, is this really happening? Is this for real? And
so my first reaction was to hit the ground, and I started firing even before I hit the ground, basically.
I remember distinctly a section commander putting in an ambush right as a word command, and this basically meant that we'd go hell for leather straight into enemy fire. I was pretty much in an open fire lane, which meant that the guys were working through hard Montana at the front, and I was in open ground, so I could cover distance running with my machine gun, but I also knew that I'd be exposed, and if the enemy were going to fire back, I'd be quite a visible target. So I sort of let go of all my fears of dying at the time and just ran and fired.
So it was quite odd that to see them wearing civilian clothes, especially white-coloured shirts, and carrying rifles and shooting back at us. But they pepper potted away from us, which means basically one knelt down and fired at us, while the other one ran back, turned around and fired at us as well. So they had some form of training. They weren't just locals with guns. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they moved away from us basically the same way we'd been trained to withdraw from a fight if we were outgunned. When that particular grenade went off, I felt a sting in my shoulder. I thought I'd been hit, but the pain quickly went away. It was only a quick, sharp sting, and then it disappeared. So I thought nothing of it and kept fighting. Anyway, as it turns out, there was 8 grenades that went off. Our section commander heard him yell out, "Grenade," being that he was throwing a grenade. And I saw him throw this grenade, and I remember my number 2 scout, who was at the lead, afterwards we were talking about it, and he was saying that he couldn't believe what he was hearing, and he actually said to me, he said, what does this bloke think this is Vietnam? And our section commander threw 2. As it turns out, the enemy threw 6 at us. One which knocked our number 1 gunner, our machine gunner, backwards. He actually got up to take a bound forward, and it went off about 2 metres in front of him. Fortunately, he wasn't injured, but it could have very easily gone the other way. It seemed as quickly as it had started, the fight had ended, and the enemy was withdrawing into thick lantana, but what we couldn't see is that there was a very steep drop-off in this lantana, and so we were still firing straight towards the enemy, when in actual fact it had already dropped off, so that most of it would have been going over their heads by the time they withdrew through the lantana.
Time probably sort of stood still for what would seem hours that were just seconds, and then other points of time it was a real rush while we were sort of engaging with the militia.
Our section commander was on the radio calling in a contact report. He was on the radio, and then he stopped speaking and he looked back down at where the enemy was, and then sort of disregarded it and kept speaking, and then he did it again. And the next thing we know, that there's this head pops up in the lantana. Our section commander he opens fire again. I opened fire again, and I started running down towards the enemy. Little did I know that my mate, my number two, had also followed me. I got up to run to my left to get a better line of sight, and I felt this whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. I can only explain it like that, beside my head, and it was an amazing thing that my head stopped moving, but my feet and body kept moving, and I actually ended up almost horizontal, and I hit the ground, and because I knew basically what it was, and as it turns out, I nearly ran directly into his fire, and the muzzle of his rifle was literally inches away from my head when I stopped, so I was very close to getting my head blown off by my mate. But I've never really forgiven myself for starters asking him to take over at the front before we even walked into the contact, because he was just as exhausted as I was, and I've felt guilty ever since then that I put him in that position, and also that when we did this clearing patrol that he was forced into going further down towards the enemy, and we could still smell them while we were doing it, and we found blood on the leaves, and there was bullet holes in the trees and things like that, a lot of sign that the enemy had left when they withdrew through the scrub.
It is believed that 3 militiamen were wounded, possibly killed, during the contact. The 5 remaining militia had probably dragged the wounded or dead back across the border into Indonesia.
The feelings that went through, that was the first time I actually felt scared, because before that it was basically just our training kicked in and we did what we were supposed to do. But that was the first real time that the terror and the realisation of the situation we were in sort of crept up on us, because the lantana was, in most places, was like, if you were inside it, you could see out, but from outside you couldn't see in, and we could smell the enemy was still close by. So the whole time we did this, I can't speak for anyone else, but for me it felt like they were basically, that they had their rifles aimed at me the whole time, just watching me. I felt like I had eyes on me. Anyway, it was about, I'd say 20 minutes after the enemy had gone that the helicopters came in and they hovered directly above us. It just moved everything, and there was no leaves left, there was no sign. Any sign that there was enemy there was just blown away. A lot of the lantana was actually crushed by the pressure of the rotor wash. So when it came to me explaining this to the military police when they were dropped in as to what happened, and I was saying I was looking through this tunnel in the Lantana. There was no sort of tunnel or Lantana there. It was all crushed. So I sort of felt like a bit of an idiot, you know. But and they sort of looked at me a bit funny. But it was quite. I was quite disappointed in that the way it happened, because it blew away any chance of them being able to track the enemy down, or as far as we thought anyway. The SAS was dropped in and they tracked the enemy a certain distance, and then they turned around and said, we can't find any more tracks, and they said, we're giving up, we're leaving. So we came back to the original contact site and we harboured there for the night. And that was quite a harrowing experience, sitting in a harbour, you know, knowing that the enemy knows exactly where you are. So every creak and groan and crack in the night basically, you know, had us pretty well on guard. The next day, they dropped in the military police to take photographs of the area, and we were told we had to pick up all of our spent cartridges, which we sort of did in disbelief. That's what you do when you're at the range. And we were told that we had to pick up our spent cartridges here too, in the middle of the scrub, after an actual firefight. So it was very, very strange experience. So we did as we were told. We picked them up and all the rest of it. Anyway, I learnt later on, 2 weeks after after the contact, a section in recon went in and they actually tracked the enemy all the way back down to the border. There was a lot of sort of questions raised in our mind as to why they couldn't track the enemy at the time, if 2 weeks afterwards they were able to track them all the way back to the border. And they found places in the grass where they'd laid bodies. And then there was all these rumours started about it being a lie. There was a letter stating that someone had dropped a grenade by accident. So that we wouldn't get in trouble, we all fired off into the bush, pretended we had a contact. And this particular patrol commander of the recon section that went through actually wrote saying that he would go toe-to-toe with anyone that said we were liars, because he'd seen exactly where it was and he'd seen all the evidence to back it up, basically, what had happened. So we got some form of relief from that, but at the same time there was an amount of doubt and mistrust amongst the blokes in the battalion, and you know, even in your own platoon. And we don't even really know where the rumours started, because we sure as hell didn't start them. It really hurt me particularly, because my integrity is everything to me, and so this was quite offensive to me. And there was other times while I was in the army where my integrity was caught in a question again, and I got quite worked up about it. And so now, if anyone ever calls my integrity into question, I get quite volatile, and I can get quite physical. We then had to write statements of what happened, and we were questioned by some senior military police, and at the time it felt like we were being treated like criminals. I at one stage said that to the MP that was questioning me, and he said, look, we're doing this because if the UN want to question you, they won't be this nice. Or in our statements we'd written that we fired in cut-off, which basically means when the enemy's withdrawing, you fire behind them with the 40mm grenades to bring them back in, which was against rules of engagement basically, but it wasn't that we fired behind them, it was that there was such a drop-off in the hill that they actually landed behind them. So because of a mistake in our statements, I'm not sure who it was, but someone said we fired in cut-off. And it was only because of our commanding officer basically turned around and told him that there was no way he was putting that they were putting our troops on charges, that the charges were dropped. This was another thing that made us sort of sit there and question. We'd just been out there and put our life on the line and done our best and nearly got killed, and then the UN themselves want to put us on trial. So after that, I lost a lot of faith in the United Nations, in all of their judgments that they made with everything we ever did over there. Because you never knew whose side they were on.
I had so much frustration, mainly at the way that we were treated, not so much by the army, but mainly by the United Nations processes. Inadvertently, we're putting Australian troops in the face of danger, but they had no experience in conflict, maybe in a cabinet room, but not in actual fighting for both Australia and fighting for the freedom for East Timorese.
At one stage, it was meant to be 18 Kapusas soldiers we went up against. Then it changed to 5, then it changed to all this different information that it just seemed to be disinformation coming more than anything. Because we knew that there was between 5 and 8. I doubt they would have withdrawn so quickly from the fight, but not only that, we would have noticed that there was a hell of a lot more men there. Through the United Nations, we were told that the Indonesians were calling us murderers because they were saying that the people we had shot were sandalwood thieves, and what they were carrying was crowbars. I don't know why you'd need crowbars to cut up sandalwood, but they were the first crowbars I've ever seen that fired shots.
Ironically, after the United Nations completes its investigation of 1-2 Alpha and gives it a clean bill of health, Corporal Kevin Bambi Campbell is awarded a UN Commander's Commendation Certificate for outstanding leadership under fire. Corporal Campbell's willingness to stand and fight on 14 June 2001 would result in the militia and its supporters avoiding any future attacks on Australian troops, whilst 4 RAR was in East Timor.
You could see that they weren't just average Timorese or militiamen. In my mind, they were experienced soldiers, Indonesian soldiers. They couldn't get caught across the border with wearing their uniforms, obviously, because it would have basically been an act of war on their part. So it was never something that they could admit, and it was definitely not something that our government would have been willing to admit either, because it would have raised more questions and made a lot of people angry. And the United Nations and Australia and Indonesia had agreements that there was going to be no crossing of the border. Children's faces that haunt me to this day. One particular little girl, and I've seen her eyes in my dreams.
Soldiers in Alpha Company 4 RAR manned the border at Junction Point Alpha. It was near the town of Batu Gade. In 1999, militia had forcibly taken East Timorese across the border into Indonesian West Timor. Because of international pressure, East Timorese were eventually allowed to return and were processed at Junction Point Alpha.
And when they got to the border, they'd all have to get off the trucks and come and be filtered through the junction point. And we'd check their passports to make sure that they were not militiamen or any undesirables, basically. That meanwhile, all of the truck drivers, who we were informed were mostly Indonesian soldiers and officers. As the little girl came to the back of the truck, myself and my section commander were there ready to help her out. She was wearing a little dress, and she would have only been maybe 10. And as she lifted her leg to step over the back of the truck, we basically saw straight up her skirt, and you could see that she'd been violated. It looked like she'd been gang raped. These truck drivers, or Indonesian officers, thought it was pretty funny and started laughing. The rage that was inside me at the time, I was just furious, but there was nothing I could do. I mean, and to be honest, I can only imagine what the blokes, the INTERFET, that the blokes that went in the first place saw compared to us. I mean, really, we didn't see anything. They saw some absolute atrocities. The guilt I feel for not being able to do anything about it, to help her, is just immense. And the rage that I feel towards the enemy, or my enemy, I should say, is something that I haven't been able to control since, because I no longer have an enemy to fight, and I take out my anger on myself in different ways, through depression and self-blame. We were given these contracts to sign, saying that we wanted to trial this new drug. Within the first couple of weeks of taking it, this is before we even went overseas, we were suffering incredible dreams, just stuff that you can't think this sort of stuff up. It just sort of, these dreams were just hell. You know, every now and again, for no particular reason at all, you would fly off the handle into a fit of rage and just lose the plot completely. It always happened within the day that we took it, or a couple of days afterwards, and then it would slowly, as the week went on, dissipate until the following Wednesday when we'd take the dose again.
In October 2001, 4 RAR finished its tour of duty and returned to Australia.
These nightmares and rage outbursts and all the rest of it continued, going long after I stopped taking this medication that they were giving us as well. I began to find myself extremely paranoid at night. I was living off base in a house that myself and a couple of mates were renting, and I'd find myself setting booby traps around the house, designed to make noise, to wake me up if there was someone moving around. I found that there was lights in the hallway. I'd leave on and close the door so that I'd see if someone was standing outside my door. I'd be able to see their feet. And every little noise at night would keep me awake. I don't really know what I was afraid of, but I mean, rationally I knew that there was no reason for anyone to want to be coming to get me. I mean, in this nightmare I was shooting the same enemy that basically I was shooting on the day of the contact, but they wouldn't go down. They kept getting up and they were shooting at me and charging towards me, and eventually I woke up screaming and I didn't know where I was, because as far as I was concerned I was back in East Timor, and to wake up in this darkened room that I was not familiar with made me quite confused and bamboozled, and I was sitting up looking around when a figure in the bed next to me reached out, and out of pure fear I started hitting the figure away, more out of panic than I wasn't attacking the person. I was more screaming and pushing. As it turns out, it was obviously my girlfriend, and she jumped on top of me and grabbed me and held me and basically had to tell me it was her and tell me I was in Australia, and it took me quite a while before I calmed down again, but that was the first thing that really scared me into going and asking for help. I'm having dramas, I'm having nightmares, I want to go and speak to one of the shrinks and just, see if they can fix me up. As far as I was concerned, it was the medication I was on that had caused this turn of events. You looked at as within that environment of fighting men, you can't have any weakness. Any weakness is found, and basically it's used against you. Unbeknownst to me, I was banned from handling any weaponry, but I was left within my platoon. Everyone else that had ever had problems was immediately taken from their platoon and either put with the Padre or put with the regimental aid post, the RAP, which is like the sick bay. What's the matter with you? And I said, look, mate, The reason I wanted help was because I was having nightmares, and I told him basically why, and he said, well, I'm having nightmares, but, who cares? Just get on with it. As I explained to him, it's not the nightmares that were upsetting me that much. It was the fact that the chance of harming someone that I cared about. And I was told by doctors, it wasn't the medication. Be out of your system now and all this sort of stuff. But if it wasn't the medication, I certainly believe that it was one of the contributing factors behind all of the problems I've had since. But I've been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorder, and to try and stop thinking about all this sort of stuff, I turned to the drink, and fortunately I've gotten a hold of it now, and I don't drink like I used to. I came to, by that stage the police had arrived. With the police, just like that, I switched it off. I rolled over and they cuffed me, and they let me stand up, and I didn't want to give them any trouble. I didn't go there to start trouble, but I could relate to the police on the level that they were just doing their job, same as I had over in East Timor, and when they had me back at the station and they were processing me, I was cracking jokes and they were all laughing, and because I didn't really understand what was going on, I was a bit out of my head. When I was locked up in the cell, my brain went back into the military. I was back as a soldier. I was a soldier again, and I was pacing this cell. I couldn't sit still. I was getting quite paranoid, and I started banging on the cell door, and one of the officers came in and he said to me, what do you want? And I said, just stop playing with me. I said, if you're going to send blokes in, do it. Just bring them on. Because in my mind, I was foreseeing them coming in with batons and all the rest of it and giving me a hiding, and to give the coppers credit, they treated me quite well. And this is, I'll give you an idea of the thoughts that were going through my head. I wasn't a civilian arrested for misconduct. I was a POW as far as I was concerned, and it was my job to escape. I tried to break open a vent in the ceiling in the cell. I was in there for a good 4 or 5 hours, and eventually I started to calm down, and I started singing all these Frank Sinatra songs. One of the officers came to the door and he said, if you keep that up, you'll be in here for longer. And he slammed the door and walked off, and I said, what was the matter? Was I out of tune? Fortunately for myself, the magistrate stopped my lawyer when he started his opening spiel and said, look, I've spent my whole lunch break reading this man's background and the circumstances surrounding his arrest. And he said, due to his service and all the rest of it, he said, I don't think this should go any further than what it has, which was a big relief to me. I mean, I was no criminal, and I've been on lots of different medications. In fact, at the moment, I'm on quite a high dose on an antidepressant that is actually 1.5 times the maximum you're supposed to be on. I have tried to do some work. In each circumstance, I got to stages where there was a real threat of me causing physical harm to either myself or others around me. So as a result, I'm on a pension. I don't like to be on a pension. I'm physically a fit and healthy sort of bloke, but just with a few bloody problems upstairs, that's all.
Pete does martial arts training, meditates, and writes poetry to help him deal with his inner demons. Scott Sherwin left the army and returned to his previous career as a tree surgeon. He's married and has a baby daughter.
This counselling guy, and he really helped me break down everything that I experienced, and through the processes it was quite hard, both emotionally for me, because I just didn't want to open up. So opening up was something that I wasn't trained for in the army, and not having the relationship with other people my own generation who experienced conflict, whereas in World War II veterans could have associated with another I regained confidence in myself again to a point that I pretty much felt back to the same way I did before I went on operations. So I'm feeling, I pretty much feel back to what you would say your old self, but you'd probably still have some memories of the experiences that might have upset you at that point of time. But overall, I often ask myself, would I do it again? And I probably would, but I would have liked to have more knowledge of what was hidden behind political agendas with Australian and Indonesian relations, so I wouldn't have felt of less value.
Nothing's a virtue and nothing's a sin. Don't know where I'm going to, where I've been. I wish I were back home on terra. I killed a man working the steel of the land, packed we in their fatkin there under the sand. No break in the airline was nothing I planned. Now I'm a man on the run. They took us from home, from our lives and our mirth. They turned us to labour and paid not its worth. Have not for the profit or gain of such dirt, till long terraform and be over.